When we realize we've done something to hurt or harm someone, it can feel really confronting because it challenges our idea of ourselves. If you are coming to terms with this, be really considerate around how you are going to engage with that person who you feel like you have harmed. They may not ever want to hear from you.
Listening is the key factor here. They put a level of trust in you. One of the most harmful things that you can do is disregard it.
And so that fear of being or feeling like you may be ostracized for some of your experiences of sexual assault or violence ultimately always ties back to the community that you serve as well.
Sexual and emotional harm doesn't just happen in some distant, anonymous way. It happens to people we know, often by people they know. It can be friends, family members, or people they work with. Maybe a friend of yours is realising months later that they were subjected to assault, and you don't know how to help. Maybe a friend is accused of harming someone, and you're struggling to reconcile this behaviour with the person you love. Or perhaps you're looking back at your own behaviour and wondering if you crossed a line. Today, we're discussing how to handle these delicate dynamics. How to seek support if you've been harmed, how to support a victim survivor, what accountability can look like if you think or you've been told that you've caused harm, and how to respond if a mate of yours has been accused of it. On the couch with me today, we have Georgia Grace, a sex educator who is normalising the conversation around intimacy, sex and relationships.
Hey.
Matty Mills, a proud Camilla man who is an advocate, podcaster and TV journalist passionate about mental health and honest conversations.
Hey.
And Zahra Al Hilaly, a UN Women Youth Champion pushing for more equitable societies.
Good to be here.
Welcome everyone. Thank you for being part of this very serious and complex conversation. We really appreciate it. These can be a little bit awkward and sometimes, I guess, vulnerable to go through. So we really appreciate your being here to talk through it with us. And just to set the tone, if anyone has a question or an anecdote they'd like to share an experience or opinion at any time, just feel free, even if it feels like a silly thing to ask. Let's just have it as an open space for everyone to chat about and answer, and feel free to ask questions. So this podcast will be split sort of into 4 different sections. We'll be looking at the different positions you might be in, including supporting a friend or family member who's been victimised, being a victim survivor of sexual violence yourself, being friends with someone who's been accused of perpetrating sexual violence, and then we'll touch on at the end if you're reflecting on your own past behaviour and you think you've caused harm. So we'll start by talking about how to support a friend or family member who has been harmed, and often friends and family are effectively the first responders or the first people entrusted with the information. So we'll kick it off, and I'll direct the first one at you, Georgia, but feel free if either Zahra or Matty, you have an answer to this as well, to jump in off the back. Georgia, what's the best way to respond if someone discloses to you that they've been harmed?
I think the first and the most important thing to do is to validate them and to tell them that you believe them. It becomes really complex and complicated when you're hearing this information and it's about someone that you love or trust, and that person is the person who has caused the harm. And I think it makes sense that a lot of people feel overwhelmed or confused when they're hearing that. But it's really important, if someone is telling us that they have experienced a sexual assault or violence or harm in any way, to validate them, because it's probably taken a lot for them to speak to you in the first place, because they've got their own things that are going through their head. Often I'll hear from people, they'll say, did I in any way make that person think that it was okay? Am I responsible for this? You know, if I tell someone, will that mean they'll get in trouble or they'll go to jail? And I don't necessarily know if I want this person to go to jail. So they've often had to go through a really big process. And if they are speaking to you about it, our responses are really, really important. So saying, I believe you. I think it's also really important for us to acknowledge that sometimes we just don't know what to say. And we could also say that, like, you can acknowledge something and say something like, I'm not sure what the best thing to say is right now, but I just know that this is really important and I'm going to be here with you through the whole process. I know that a lot of people, friends or family members who are really staunch might want to be like, okay, let's take them down. Like they need to, pay for their actions. And, some people may be on board with that as well, but others may not. And I think we also sort of need to listen to the victim survivor in the approach that they want to take and what feels best and safest for them, because what they want to need might be really different to what you think is best for them.
Do you find that with the clients you work with, when have they expressed to you that when people have responded by saying, oh, I don't really know what to say, but I just want to be here, that they're just as, I don't know if satisfied is the right word, but I can't think of another one right now, but just as validated by that response as someone being able to like sort of articulate themselves a bit better?
Yeah, I think...
Because that's really nice to know as like just someone who might be in the position of responding one day.
Yeah, I think that what I will hear a lot is that people will say, I know someone doesn't have the right words, and sometimes it's hard when they're trying to say the perfect thing and they're just not.
Yeah.
And I think that can also be in terms of grief as well. Like a lot of times people can make it about themselves. So if someone's going through something painful, we try to relate to them, and often a way that human beings relate is they say the exact same thing has happened to me. So it's different for everyone. In some cases that can be really validating because you feel like you're not alone, but then in other cases someone may think, oh, I just wanted to know that you're here for me and you're listening to me. So even being upfront and acknowledging, hey, I might be a bit clunky at this, but know that I'm going to really try to support you. I think that often a really common response when people see me in session, they'll say that it's the first time that they've heard someone say that they're believed.
Oh,
and
right.
I will often name that and I'll say, I just want to let you know that I believe you, and everything you're saying I believe. And they will say thank you because no one's actually ever said that to me. So I think that's a really important and validating first step.
Absolutely. Matty, do you think there are some unhelpful or harmful ways people can respond?
Yeah, absolutely. I love what you've said, and just to extend on that, I think not minimizing, the experience as well. I think that when someone discloses to you, they've gone through a whole process themselves. There's a lot of weight behind what they're telling you. It's maybe one of the toughest things they've ever had to do in their life up to that point. So the disclosing, I think making sure that you're not brushing it off, but seeing it as something that is extremely heavy for that individual, and making sure that you're giving it the weight that it deserves in terms of your response. So not minimizing that experience, because I think that's super harmful. I also think that listening is the key factor here, really being present and trying to understand, what this experience was for this person, and understanding that they put a level of trust in you to be able to disclose something like this. So, ensuring that you're not, that you're aware of how important this moment is in the journey of this person disclosing, and ensuring that you're really with them in that. And I think one of the most harmful things that you can do is disregard it, or give them a sense that maybe you don't believe them.
Yeah.
I think don't allow them to feel doubt about this in that moment.
Would there, what do you think sort of good listening looks like versus maybe overstepping? Because there might be a temptation, I would imagine, to ask questions to either A, get to the bottom of it, or just know exactly what happened. But sort of what is the difference between good listening to what they're saying and maybe overstepping the line in that sense?
I think I do this in my job a lot. I'm a presenter on TV and I'm interviewing people a lot. And one of the key things that when I speak to young First Nations kids who want to do what I do, I say the best part about this job is actually listening. Because when we listen and our mind isn't going to the next question, for instance, through my work, I'm not thinking about what I'm going to ask next. I'm actually just listening to every word that this person is telling me. The information that they give you will digest better for you and you understand it as a more whole experience. I also think that sometimes we have, our own, I suppose, ways of wanting to deal with a situation that just don't align with the victim. So I think that the initial response might be, oh, okay, well, I need a solution. You've come to me for a solution. When I don't think necessarily that's exactly what they're asking for. I think they're asking to be heard, to be seen, to be validated. And by listening and actively listening and maybe even practically repeating some of the things they're telling you so that they know that you've fully understood.
That's quite a relatable way to think about it, because I don't want to use this analogy to minimise the topic that we're talking about, but even when it comes to sort of venting about your day at work to someone that is close to you, you never really want a solution, do you? You just want them to listen to you, right? One of the sort of things that we find young people teach us consent is an unhelpful way to respond, is that sort of instinct to really push to report it. And we know that sort of formally reporting it comes with a lot of complications and isn't always the best route. Zahra, do you think you could maybe touch on why people might not want to formally report a sexual assault?
Yeah, I think particularly providing a culturally and religious perspective as well. I've heard from so many survivors about the fear of being ostracised from their community. I think there are so many different layers to this, and there is so much fear that is ingrained within particularly those whose honour is tied to community as well. I consistently hear this fear in that, disclosing their experiences of sexual assault automatically means that they've brought shame upon their family, but also upon their community. And I think a good example of this is to maybe provide a example of honour within community. I am a lawyer in my professional background, and when I was admitted as a lawyer, this brought so much honour to my family. Now, if I was to experience some harm and the community started to shun me, this would then fall onto my family, and they'd feel like their honour was being criticised, their honour was being consistently degraded by our community. And particularly for individuals who come from a refugee and immigrant community where, they are new to societies like Australia, where they rely on community members, they rely on the relationships that they've built. It is so important to solidify how community supports us as well. So these support systems that are entrenched within our own communities have played a big part in our survival in countries like Australia. And so that fear of, being or feeling like you may be ostracised for some of your experiences of sexual assault or violence ultimately always ties back to the community that you serve as well. And I hear this by so many women, particularly in my community who are Muslim and who do wear the hijab. I think another element to this as well is that, unfortunately, there is a deep-rooted connection with your honour being placed in your virginity as well.
Right.
And particularly for Muslim women who come from a society or a culture which places high value in the concept and the notion of virginity, there is some fear that your status as a woman declines. And this is something that I think we really need to decolonise within our own internal communities. It's not a conversation that's being held with elders. It's not a conversation that's being had with our own generation, our own young people as well. It's not a conversation that's being had at Friday sermon, for example. And so when I speak to young women within my own community who are Muslim and who do wear the hijab, something that I always try to reframe the conversation to look like is not using bold language like consent or sexual violence, because again, I as a native Arabic speaker, I've never been told what these terms look like in Arabic. I don't know what they translate to, which is shocking,
Really? Yeah.
And so I try to reframe it rather as, a violation of dignity. Dignity is karama in Arabic. And by utilising digestible language that makes sense, this is how we have some of these more meaningful conversations amongst each other, to reframe the narrative that is more digestible to young girls who have no idea that what they've experienced goes beyond their honour, goes beyond their virginity status, goes beyond their community honour as well. It is so deeply entrenched with our survival.
Thank you for sharing that, Zahra. I feel like everyone could be a little bit more considerate of the circumstances and communities that different people find themselves in. So I might direct this sort of a similar question to you, Matty. Why do you think people in your community might not necessarily report or formally report a sexual assault?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind with this question is that there is a tricky relationship between the First Nations community and the justice system.
Yeah.
I think when we look at the generations of trauma that has been experienced and the lack of understanding, empathy towards my community from maybe the people who are supposed to be helpful to your community. When that relationship is very tarnished, I think that it can be quite hard for First Nations people to truly believe that justice is possible if that's what they're seeking. But I also think that there has been a lack of education around cultural context of my community. And I think that colonisation has a huge part to play in this. You know, over the last 250 years in this country, so much identity has been stripped, so much culture has been stripped, and the ways that the world operates now in this Western world is very different to how my community is based and what my community is rooted in. And I think there's a level of distrust that plays a role in that relationship that is detrimental to my community. So I think, you know, as a First Nations person, we are constantly trying to figure out, you know, what avenues have been informed from our culture as well, because there's so much that just contradicts who we are as people in the Western world. But when it comes to my community, we lean on each other a lot. You know, there's such an insular, I suppose, dynamic within my culture that we have an openness and there is a circle of care that is paramount when it comes to people being looked after. But I also think that the Western world has, you know, destroyed a large part of that.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that as well, Matty. And it makes me quite not to put myself in the driver's seat here, but that's quite sad to hear. So obviously I'd love everyone to answer this with respect to their individual communities, but I might start with you again, Georgia. What do you think sort of needs to change in our collective culture and individual communities so people feel safer coming forward to share these experiences?
Oh, huge question. Everything. I think so much change needs to happen. I really think it comes down to this piece around education for people to really understand what harm is and what harm looks like. We need to understand the ways in which power and different intersections of identities also influence the way that someone feels like they can make a decision or the ownership they have of their body, or you know, the ways in which consent feels really tricky to navigate based on a power that they may or may not have in a situation. I think we need more services that are supporting victim survivors for when or however they decide to seek support so that they can, you know, easily access that. I think that, Matty, to your point around the legal system, there is so much distrust with the fact that, you know, the amount of people who, even if they do go to report it, are told that this is going to be a really painful and re-traumatizing and awful experience. Are you sure you want to go through with it? Like that is what victim survivors are told. So there is no trust. But then I think it's a lot, we need to look at the media. I mean, these huge cases that we've seen, Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, Brittany Higgins, like when victim survivors speak up, they are vilified. The ways in which people speak about them online. And I think that, you know, the victim survivors may not hear, you know, this person commenting on the post, but other people will. Other victim survivors are seeing this, that friends or family will be looking at this, or even just sort of the general public, and we take in those ideas, and then that informs like a culture and a discussion around what people think will happen if they do speak up. So there isn't this safety. I think it's, you know, education, it's resources, it's collective awareness, and really just having like empathy and care, because I think it's so horrifying that when someone says they've been through harm, that so often people aren't, you know, opening their arms and saying, wow, that's awful. Like, I can't believe that has happened to you. I can't believe someone did that to you. And instead they're met with pushback and prove it and describe it. And yeah, I think it's such a huge question, and I'm sure there's, you know, so many things that you two would say to it as well.
Yeah, loaded question. You know, I think about some of the women in my life that have disclosed some of their experiences of sexual violence to me, and I often hear the notion of, what about my kids? Or is my visa going to be stripped away if they're a refugee? Or what will the community say, as we spoke about previously? What about my family? What about my parents? What about my siblings? Is it going to affect them? Is it going to affect their prospects of marriage? And I think it really goes back to that education piece that you spoke about, Georgia. I think ultimately, I always hear this notion that it is our silence that helps us survive. And I think it's really so integral to ensure that we are having these discussions within our community. Unfortunately, we're not. I think back to my own religious community. I mean, every Friday, our Friday sermon right before Friday prayer is so integral to providing vision and providing lessons of learning to different community members. And we know that there is so much trust with the religious leaders. And so why aren't we having some of these discussions with the religious leaders? Why aren't we having some of these discussions with community elders as well? I think it's really about reclaiming that narrative and recognising that this is an intergenerational issue that concerns every member of our society, every member of our community. And, you know, whilst I'm speaking here with you folks today, it goes without saying that I'm still worried that we're never going to have these discussions. I mean, sometimes, despite working in this space, some of the conversations that I have with my own mum and dad, they don't understand what's going on. This really requires our elders and the leaders in our community to be a part of these narratives. And I think it's such a long process. It goes without saying that I think that our greatest tool is having conversations with the next generation of young people within my own community, knowing that there are still layers and barriers of fear that are entrenched within having conversations like these.
Well said, yeah. How about you, Matty? What do you think? How does sort of what cultural changes would you like to see through that sort of First Nations lens?
Absolutely. I think the first thing that comes to mind is that what is really buried beneath the surface is that the very systems that are supposed to be helping or are the places that you seek help for my community are the same systems that did what perpetrators do. You know, this the brutality of the beginning of this country, the women who were sexually assaulted, the children that were taken away, that began the journey of colonisation in this country. It is so deeply entrenched in trauma for First Nations people, especially women. Yeah. First Nations women are one of the most vulnerable people, and the strongest, I must say, in our community. And I think that there is such a disconnect between really feeling compelled to be believed. You know, I don't think that I think there is a massive barrier between our community and what our community structure is when it comes to men and women's business, and how we seek care and how we look after one another, and the systems that are currently in place. You know, I think that there's a level of decolonisation that has to happen for our people to feel supported.
Okay, so to shift focus a bit, because we've spoken about how to support people who, to borrow your words, Zahra, have had their dignity violated. But now if we shift to someone who has experienced being victimised, delayed realisations are really common, and we've heard about them a bit across these podcast episodes. So sort of where people don't realise immediately that they've been subjected to harm. So Georgia, why is it that someone might take a while to label their experience as sexual assault, and in some cases they may never label it as that?
Yes. So there are many different answers to this question. So what happens when we've been through something triggering or traumatizing? Our bodies may be responding in a way that is doing whatever it can to help us get through that. So that's where we might look at the fight, flight, or freeze and fawn response. And it's really common in an assault or in violence or in trauma for someone to go into a freeze response. So they kind of shut down or they disassociate and they're not present, they're not there. But then there's also the fawn response, and the fawn response is pretty much any time someone is really scared and terrified, but instead of fighting back, they try to appease the aggressor. So they may be nice to the aggressor, they may comply because in their mind and in their body, they're thinking, I just need to do whatever I can do to get through this. So that's really confusing for someone. If they've been nice to someone, and I'll even hear it from my clients whereby they'll say, I was assaulted, I was violated, and then I got home and I texted my abuser and I checked in with them, or I said, hey, I'm sorry I was a bit weird about that, or I'm sorry I behaved in that way. And that feels really confronting for them because they're confused. They didn't want to do the things that were done to them. They didn't want the assault or the rape to happen. However, they were just trying to get by. But then I think what we need to do is understand what's going on in the brain in a triggering or a traumatizing event. So let's look at like the left and the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere of the brain is responsible for our emotional experiences, our somatic, our body experiences. And the left hemisphere is responsible for our languaging or our analyzing, our sequencing. And what often happens in a traumatizing event is the left hemisphere goes offline. So we're not analytically or sequentially or intellectually sort of present and there. However, we are still feeling. And so what can happen is that our memories can feel distorted. And whilst we have the pain and the feeling of what was going on in the trauma, we can't necessarily make sense of it, or we can't bring language to it. So even, and that's really, really simplified, I guess, the brain on trauma. But that's why someone might say, I'm confused, or I'm not necessarily sure what happened, because as a survival response, their brain was essentially saying, hey, I need to protect you in getting through this, and maybe you'll disassociate. But then what can happen is our memories can get fragmented later. And so someone might only realize months, years, decades later that what was done to them was an assault. And then that's really confusing as well, because they're like, that was so long ago, how come I'm only realizing this now?
I've never heard the side of the brain thing explained. That's so interesting. Zahra, you spoke before about sort of not using such harsh language like sexual assault in your communities. So from like a cultural and religious perspective, why might people be hesitant to label it as that? Does it come back to the honour piece?
Look, to give a good example, my sister actually teaches at an Islamic school, and I don't think they've ever had any consent education. I mean, I'm sitting here listening to you, George, and I'm feeling astounded. My mind is blown because I'm thinking, goodness, I wasn't ever privy to this information as well. So for communities like mine to come in with such bold language, and it's not even bold, it's just the language that is meant to be used, it's scary. I mean, you're scared of the unknown. We all know that the notion of being scared of something that you don't know, and to come in with language that is used by the media, that is, I mean, for example, consent equals rape often by the media, or sexual violence equals, as the media would put it, the perfect victim notion of, you know, running away from a situation and screaming and fighting back and having your clothes ripped off and immediately reporting it. I mean, for members in my community, that unfortunately they're not going to fit into this mold of being a perfect victim. So of course, having conversations with language that is coupled with their experiences of not fitting into this mold of a perfect victim can be so confusing. And so I again, as I previously mentioned, when I do speak to victim survivors in my own community, I think it's meant to be done with such care and such stability in being guided by them. Of course, I think you both provided some incredible tactics on how we actively listen. But once again, I think for communities like mine, where there is such a fear of using such bold language because that automatically means one thing or another thing that can be so frightening and so unknown to us, and it can also mean, you know, resulting to so many misconceptions like losing your visa status, as I previously mentioned, or being shunned by the community. There is 101 different thoughts processing through your head. So I guess in my mind, I usually try to reframe it to religious, especially when I'm speaking to Muslim women who are practicing or who have experienced sexual violence. I do try to utilize religious language. However, I do want to really emphasize that it is so important, especially when speaking to individuals who have experienced sexual violence from a religious community, to not use terminology like this was written for you, or this was your destiny, or you were meant to experience this, or this was God's plan for you. I think it's so important to differentiate what's helpful language versus what's unhelpful language. And notions like that can be very, very unhelpful. It can be very scary for a victim, and it can often place them in a space where they start to blame themselves. They start to blame, okay, if I was a better Muslim, would I have not experienced this? Or is God punishing me? But rather, I think using gentle language like, you know, there is justice in our religion, and there is, you know, you were violated your honor, as I had previously mentioned. Utilizing language that reinforces justice and reinforces care and love is so integral.
I have a question actually, because I often will hear from people that they find it really, they find that their agency is taken away from them when someone else names their assault for them or tells them what they've experienced, rather than allowing for them to name it themselves. And I think what I'll hear often is people will say, I don't call it a rape, or I don't call it an assault, and that's, you know, their choice to call it whatever feels safe and right for them. But I'm wondering, given your consideration of like language and the importance of language, how might we be able to go into a conversation with someone and give them the autonomy to define it for themselves?
Absolutely. That's a very wonderful question that you've raised there, Georgia. And I guess in communities like mine, unfortunately, the word abuse, unfortunately, is often synonymous with being raped. If you've experienced sexual violence, it's automatically synonymous with being raped. And that can be so scary. So when we speak about creating these safe spaces, I think it really is important about mapping out what support systems are in place to be able to allow them the autonomy to seek further education, or to find different people who have experienced similar experiences that they have. So usually when I do speak to young women in my own community, I do try to frame it as, okay, do you want to come with me to a lecture that's speaking about this issue? Or do you want to come with me to speak to one of my colleagues who runs workshops in this area? I try not to do any definition. I try not to utilize any definitions, but rather provide different opportunities for learning together. And I think that key word is together. I think entering some of these spaces where an individual is able to recognize and able to express and understand what they've been through is so scary alone, especially when you come from a culture that is so deeply entrenching some of these experiences with shame.
It's really, yeah, I want to say it's amazing to hear that again, but I don't want that to come off the wrong way. It's just from like where I'm sitting without sort of the context of being in those communities. It's really great that you're sharing that insight. So thank you, Zahra. I really appreciate that. But everyone's speaking so beautifully and eloquently. And it always feels bad when I got to move on to the next question, you know. But I do want to acknowledge as well that while the majority of victim survivors are women, men can obviously be victimised as well. So, Matty, why do you think men might struggle to label their experience as sexual assault?
Yeah, I think, there's been such, I don't want to say pressure, but, as men in society, we haven't been celebrated or encouraged, I should say, to, be emotional beings, be in touch with our emotions, be emotionally intelligent. It's always sort of been the opposite. And I even think in my community, sometimes there is a level of that. But as a queer man, I find that it's easier for me actually to express myself emotionally. It might not be the case for other people, but I think that there's a lot of pressure on men to be staunch and be strong and suck it up and, push on. But these experiences happen, of course, to men as well, and not as often. But to men who have gone through these experiences, I think there's an extra layer of shame there. And there is, parts of that masculinity that is tarnished. I think there's a lot of shame that comes with that. I think that you don't know who you should talk to or how you should express it. I think it's a challenging thing for a lot of men.
And also the social construction, as you were saying, Matty, around what it means to be a sexual man and the ideas that a lot of young boys or a lot of men take into sexual encounters. And I think that it's really horrifying to hear when a boy or a teenager or a young man is assaulted by someone else, particularly when there is that dynamic of power, someone who is older than them. And if it is the dynamic of a young boy and an older woman, what they will often be faced with is the idea of being the lucky one, like the one who got to have sex with the teacher, or they got to fulfill the pornified dream.
Yeah.
And so then when they're met with these messages, and it's horrifying to even see, like, I think recently I've been looking in my feed and seeing things of Justin Bieber sort of coming out, and he was this young pop star, and the ways in which hosts would like grab him and sexualize him and say, can't wait for you to be 18. And these were, all genders were doing it, but people who were in their 30s, 40s and 50s, and this child was subjected to this. So there's that piece as well. And then there's also homophobia. And, a lot of young boys, if they were assaulted by an older man, we live in a homophobic society. And, people may also have internalized homophobia as well that they're unaware of. So that can get in the way of them speaking out because they think, oh, well, if I was raped or assaulted by someone, I looked like I was enjoying it because my body was responding in a certain way. Does that say something about my identity? And that can feel really confusing.
Yeah, wow. Another great explanation. Thank you, Georgia. So to kind of bring this part of the ep to a close before we get on to being friends with someone who's been accused of perpetrating sexual violence, and then if you're reflecting on past behaviours and you think you may have caused harm, we'll get to those. But to wrap this section up about what to do if you're potentially a victim survivor yourself, what would you encourage people realising their dignity has been violated or that they have been harmed to do? Like, whether it's first steps, telling friends, family, a therapist. What would your advice be, Zahra?
I think, to preface, advice isn't homogenous, and it's really dependent on who you're speaking to, where they're at, what layers are and barriers may impose on their ability to really acknowledge and even seek justice. So I think I would never walk into a situation with the one set approach, especially when I hear someone disclose to me and they have an abundance of different worries. I think, as we had previously spoken about, it is really important to listen. What support do they need? What support are they asking for? Is it just a friend? Is it support to report this? Is it support to speak to a trusted family or community member? So I don't really have a one set solution, but rather I think it's just about showing up. And it's as simple as that. I think it's as simple as just showing up with food. I think people really underestimate that. You know, you can just show up to a mate's house and bring some food and just have a conversation. It's about watching a movie. So I think for communities like mine, I wouldn't acknowledge or use language, but rather I'd build that community of trust and safety, especially when a victim survivor has disclosed with me. I think that foundational step of building that environment where they feel heard, not judged, and safe to speak up on their own terms and their own merit is the first step for me. I think from that step, I'm then able to really recognise what support they need, and I think it really needs to be driven by them. It is important to ensure that they have the full autonomy to make these decisions on their own. And of course, sometimes it's not possible, and sometimes there are different barriers that can affect their autonomy as well. But again, it's really integral to build that foundation of trust before you step into options.
Yeah.
I really liked your language, Zahra, around there's no blueprint. Like there's not a one thing that we do. I think the first thing that we do, as I said at the start, is validate it. I don't bring my own language to it, but I ask them to language it. I recognize that going into it, and this is probably something we do need to speak about, not everyone will be able to detail or to speak about the trauma, that sometimes that takes a lot of time and a lot of therapy to even be able to revisit that. So bringing language to it just might not be possible. But basically what we're doing is they have often felt like they had no agency, autonomy, safety or control. And it can be an act of harm to remove agency from someone and to say, this is what I think you should do. Right. And I think hearing you both speak, it's really integrating this awareness for me that seeking justice is a white, patriarchal, colonial approach that we have in Australia. And I think if we are really going to talk about consent and education and safety and healing, we need to get in as many voices as possible, because currently the way we understand it is in a binary. Good, bad, right, wrong, do something, don't do something. And that is leaving out the vast majority of people from getting anywhere close to healing their trauma. So it is such an individual and a nuanced approach, and I think that is the care that we have to take when we're having these conversations.
Georgia, I did have a follow-up question. I'm particularly coming from the perspective of, working with individuals who have feared the approaches that have been presented to them and have feared usually the systems that are attached to these approaches as well. I've previously been in situations where I've mapped out the different approaches that a victim survivor can take to really process and understand or even seek justice, and this usually is met with so much fear. How do we address that fear when providing options?
Yeah, I think that often and perhaps I'm limited in what I can speak to here because I don't have an awareness, or like I'm not trained to work with someone from a legal perspective. So maybe I sort of need to mention that. Often what we might do is recognize the urgency that someone feels. So this fear may emerge because there is an urgency that I need to do something straight away. I need to do something right now. So what we might do is just acknowledge that and be like, these are the options. It can feel really overwhelming, and I can understand that this is scary, like hearing all of this language. And anytime, we talk about anything legal, if you get a letter from the government, it's terrifying to see the coat of arms. Like that, I think recognizing that this is scary, and if you are scared and fearful, that is okay. Like, it makes sense. But maybe what we can do is sort of remove the urgency of needing to do something right now and just go moment by moment and figure out what feels like the best approach for you, because there is not one approach. That's kind of what is coming to mind for me now. What do you both think of that?
Well, I was going to ask you, I think when it comes to somebody disclosing, if it's ongoing violence and the harm is continuing, is there a line in the sand of what you can and can't do when it comes to going against maybe what your friend or the person who's disclosing to you wants in terms of protecting them?
Yes, yeah. Oh, this is a big one. So I guess like if it's coming from a friend's perspective here, it could be saying something along the lines of, my care for you as a friend, my alarm bells are kind of going off a bit. Like I can feel my ears prick up, or I feel a bit nervous or sad or anxious, hearing this. And I want you to know that I'm here for you in whatever decision you make. What can happen is if we go in real hard line and if we say, that's abuse, that's assault, your partner is causing harm, what can happen is your friend who just confided in you now sees you as not being on their side.
Yeah.
So then they may alienate and isolate themselves from you. And it's really tricky as a friend, because I get it. Like, as a friend, if someone you love is in pain or being harmed, you want to protect them. You want to wrap them up. But sometimes it's not as simple as that. And sometimes what we need to do is we need to think, how can I make sure that they know that I'm here for them, that I will always be there for them, that I can be a shelter, or I can be a safe space, or I can be an open set of arms for them to go to. It may also be worth, looking into, there's so many great resources. I know Teach Us Consent have a lot of resources, as well as the best approaches you can do as a friend or as a trusted person if the harm is ongoing. So heading to their website for more resources on that. But I think the first thing is in the best way possible, how can you still be an ally to them and not alienate them, and definitely not give them an ultimatum?
I'm reluctant to move the conversation on because I love where it went. I love that it started with maybe foolishly advice for victim survivors, and it came back to a place of we reframed it to advice for people supporting, because there absolutely probably shouldn't be that much, if any, responsibility on the victim survivors to, other than obviously giving them autonomy. They shouldn't have to have all this responsibility after experiencing something so traumatic. So to now look at the experience of being friends with someone who has been accused, I mean, I think it's a pretty relatable feeling these days. Like, so many people can't even comprehend the fact that their favourite actor has potentially committed sexual assault because they were so good in that movie, to then the experience of going, well, hang on a second, that friend that I get coffee with every Saturday who's never done anything wrong to me, how on earth could they do this? Why? Like, I mean, maybe I've just answered part of the question there, Matty, but why do you think people struggle so much to comprehend that perhaps a friend or a family member has done something like this?
Oh, it's such a hard thing to grapple. I think it's, we see people in our lives inherently as good, the people that we keep close to us, maybe the family members, And I think that we want people to be good, you know, we want people not to have an experience that tarnishes your view of them. And I think it's really difficult to come to terms with how much impact a sexual assault or violence can have on an individual. You know, I think that it's such a life-altering and changing experience for someone that if you know somebody who has enabled that experience or done that experience to somebody, or, you know, the perpetrator, I think it's really hard to come to terms with because we don't want to see them in that light. And I think that statistics show that a lot of these cases are people that are within our families, you know, and that are close to the victims. Somebody you know most of the time, which is just a scary thing to comprehend. I know, you know, an experience that happened in my family many years ago, and I won't talk about the person in detail, but a life-altering experience happened in my family by somebody who they knew. And that experience created a disconnection immediately with that person who was the perpetrator, and created long-lasting effects for the victim who, you know, whose life changed forever. And since that moment, that person has never been the same. And there's been a lot of trauma that has been handed down from generation to generation because of that experience. And I think in that example, it was actually, you know, it was really difficult to see the impact on that person and still. And so my, I suppose, concern or care for the person who did it didn't exist. And I think that that's also an experience. You know, the empathy wasn't there for the perpetrator at all, but that's also something that I think needs to be explored.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for sharing that, by the way. That's a really personal experience. I got to imagine that's difficult to vocalise in a room full of strangers to give people a peek behind the scenes.
It is. I think, you know, earlier I spoke about the weight of these experiences, and because I've seen it, I've felt it, I see how heavy it is for somebody to go through life after something like that has happened to them. I don't see it as anything that is light. I see it as a really heavy thing to carry through the world.
Absolutely. And I like what you touched on about sort of, I guess, cutting that person off, because that is something I think worth exploring. And do you think, George, that this is a good way to deal with this stuff? Like, is it a great show of disapproval to cut that person out of your life? And is there anything we need to consider before cutting a person out like that?
Again, I think we could fall into like good, bad, right, wrong, binary territory, and I'm really sort of hesitant to go down that path because, you know, for someone, cutting that person off is not only in line with their values, but it might to protect them and to keep themselves safe. So that might be a choice that they need to make for safety, for survival. For others, it might be that they aren't willing or able to engage with this person. But then if we were to expect everyone to cut people off, then that adds shame to them and responsibility to them to come up with the perfect response, rather than examining the perpetrator and examining their responsibilities and what they need to do. And it shifts the responsibility onto others. So I think that there isn't a right or wrong way. People will decide based on their, you know, environment, based on the many different things that are influencing their life and the things that are important and essential to them. There are, like, I think if we are looking at varying degrees or ways we can sort of call out or call in someone, it can be really important for a lot of people to have this conversation with a perpetrator And often if you are going to do that, it is useful to do that if you feel safe to. And of course, this is so like dependent on the situation. But say, for example, if you've heard something that someone's done and you want to bring their attention to it, to have that conversation, maybe one-on-one with them, to talk to them about it, to let them know about why their behavior is so dangerous or harmful. But again, like even saying that now, you may be stepping into a situation where a victim survivor doesn't want you to step into it. So it really is so dependent. And I think the first thing we do, which seems to be a theme that is emerging in this conversation, is we ask the victim survivor how we can best support them, and we respect that, because that can feel like another violation if you come in and you tell them how you're going to behave and how the situation could go. And again, they may feel like they lose their agency and control. What do you both think of that?
I mentioned earlier before we started around the idea of empathy, you know, towards a perpetrator. And it's something that recently, I think as you go through therapy yourself and you're on your own journey of things that you're working through in your life, maybe there's a level of, I don't want to say the word understanding, because I feel like it may come across like you're in agreement or accepting of a behaviour, which it's absolutely not right. But I think that some behaviours and some actions taken by people are because of what's happened to them and of some circumstances that maybe they faced in their own life. So I don't think there's any blanket rule when it comes to, you know, that example I shared of cutting that person off out of my family's life. That was something that was done and we were okay with. But I don't think that's a blanket rule that can fit, because each situation is very unique to the people involved in the circumstance and the experiences. Yeah, so it's a difficult one, but I definitely think as I'm getting older, I'm 30 years old, but like as I'm, you know, working through my own life and in therapy myself, I think that I've come to understand how important understanding is, and empathy and compassion, even towards people who have done the worst things. One thing that comes to mind is, you know, my brother was murdered by someone at 32 years old, and I never thought that I would have empathy or compassion for the perpetrator. Yet I'm getting there. Something's bubbling away. And that is so shocking to me, because forgiveness isn't always something that I thought would be possible. But, you know, it depends how much work you do, I suppose. It's really important to do that.
Sorry to hear that, Matty.
Yeah.
Thank you, Matty.
That's okay.
Yeah. And I also hope I didn't make you feel before when I phrased that question to Georgia as if we're trying to get to the bottom of if cutting them off was the right or wrong thing
No,
for you
no,
to do, by the way.
No, of course not.
There's sort of no binary here, but we do want to kind of further explore this idea about maintaining a friendship with someone who's potentially perpetrated sexual violence, but while also keeping them accountable. Because like it obviously can be tough in reality if you've got a 10-year friendship with someone and it's been 10 great years and you hear this thing that is awful. So do we think there's sort of a line or certain things we can say or do? Do you have any thoughts on that, Zahra?
Yeah, I want to reframe my answer in the context of relationships where an individual doesn't have the basic consent education, right? Because when we speak about consent education, it's not just to potential victim survivors, but also to potential perpetrators as well. Yeah. And so I'm thinking about individuals in my community whilst I answer this, and how they would navigate a friendship if they don't have that underlying education that we do on this panel discussion, and how they would go about that. And I think the first point is recognizing that ickiness that is in your throat. And, you know, whenever I hear and I speak to children and young people and they don't really know how to share some of their perspectives, it usually is just, the notion that their heart started to race, or they felt like their throat was being clogged up, or they knew in their bones and in their reaction that, their friend was disclosing something that didn't sit right with them. So how do these individuals have conversations, and how do they call out behaviour when they don't have, the knowledge about consent, and they don't know what language is best utilised in situations like this? And the reason why I want to frame it from that angle is because, again, a lot of children and young people, as we implement this national curriculum of consent, they are still adapting to new information that is coming out. So having these conversations very, very early on in a simple manner can sometimes be very effective. And I guess some advice that I would have for children and young people who are having those hard conversations, and about how to have these conversations in an effective manner, is, number one, to have these conversations very calmly and have them delivered in a way that centres care for the perpetrator. And I know this isn't a very popular opinion, but what we really want to emphasise, especially for children and young people who are potential perpetrators, is we need to keep that door open. We cannot shun away potential perpetrators from having this access to education to do better and to be better. We're starting to have these conversations in a way that centralises empathy, just as you'd mentioned, Matty. And having these conversations in a way that centres collective care and community is so integral, because, again, you're welcoming questions, you're welcoming individuals to share their perspectives in a safe space for learning and for perspective building as well. And don't get me wrong, especially if you are having some difficult conversations where you do know that an individual, your friend or your family member, is a perpetrator of sexual violence, it can feel tricky. But I think especially for a perpetrator who comes from a culture or a background where they don't know that their actions are contributing or are compromising sexual violence, that keeping that doorway is so important. So again, focusing on compassion and empathy and an opportunity for learning is so important. Now, I think the next part of this wave of learning is to really focus on action and not intent, and action for accountability as well. Of course, I think, as we've all thoroughly mentioned throughout this conversation, this isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. Of course, every situation is going to look different, but for especially children and young people who don't have the basic foundational knowledge that their actions are compromising sexual violence or assault, it is very important to recognise and to consistently focus on their action rather than focusing on why they had done this. And I think the reason why I focus on action is because it's very important to recognise that this was wrong and there is no justification to behaviour. Of course, I think it is important for learning in the future for a perpetrator to recognise that their actions may have, for example, been influenced by certain circumstances in their lives or their family dynamics or their culture. But it is also very important to recognise, particularly in that moment, that this was wrong, and there is an urgency for accountability.
I think that's really well said, Zahra. And that's a really sort of progressive, empathetic approach. And it actually brings us to our last topic really well, which is to talk about, if you're reflecting and realising that perhaps you've perpetrated sexual harm, and then what does accountability look like if you're reflecting and having those realizations? So to kind of maybe elaborate on what Zahra was saying, Georgia, what are some reasons people might struggle to recognise their past or current harmful behaviours?
I think it can come down to the fact that we all like to see ourselves as inherently good people, that when we realise we've done something to hurt or harm someone, it can feel really confronting because it challenges our idea of ourselves. And it, might be because of a lack of education or a lack of awareness around what they've done was indeed harmful or was indeed like a violation. I think it's a really common response for people to be defensive. We have this tendency to be defensive to prove that, we are in fact a good person. I think people can also be really scared. Like they worry, they are ashamed of what they've done, and they are fearful of what this may mean next, and the ways in which they may have to provide care for this person and what that could even look like, especially because there is such limited information on what it would look like to seek legal justice and so on. And I think that one thing to keep in mind is that really we all, I think, have the capacity to harm others, like, whether it's intentional or not. Like, we all may have been in a situation where we hugged someone when they didn't want to be hugged, or we said something to someone that was suggestive and they didn't want their body spoken about in that way. So even if we're kind of bringing it back to maybe a conversation that isn't just about rape or really, extreme sexual violence, but instead we could look at the ways in which we may engage with bodies on an everyday basis, that now we're having these conversations around consent, and we're learning that, it is important to ask someone whether they want to kiss you before you go in for a kiss, or it is important to ask someone if they want to try something new sexually if you've never done it before. I think that feels really confronting, and I'm sure people may have been listening to many of the conversations that have been had throughout this series where they may reflect, oh, have I always been really tapped into consent? Have I always really been checking in? And I think a really important thing to acknowledge is if you are coming to terms with this, that's confronting. However, be really considerate around how you are going to engage with that person who you feel like you have harmed, because they may not ever want to hear from you. They may not be willing. And I think that what people may do is they want to get the forgiveness. They want to, get back to a space of feeling good. They want to rid themselves of all responsibility and be like, are we good? Like, we're good, right? So instead, really check in with yourself and recognize that you could be doing more harm by reaching out to them and demanding that they forgive you. How can you go and get support? And this will be about action. So is there a professional you can speak to? Is there certain steps that you can take to really learn and to address this behavior? How can you have conversations with your friends as well, which might be, hey, I'm realizing that I've done things that are not cool and not good, and I want to talk to you all about it because I'm embarrassed and I'm ashamed, but I'm also realizing that that was really, really bad, and I think we need to work together as well. There's some things that come to mind for me.
And then so obviously with that, you don't want to put your discomfort at your realization at the center of an apology, as you said, because they might not ever want to hear from you again. So then what does a genuine apology look like, and one that's not prioritizing getting forgiveness and clearing your own conscience?
So I guess if it's the case that they've come to you and they've said, hey, you did this and it was painful. As you said, Zahra, I think let's bring awareness to our bodies. How does it feel to hear that? You might feel like you're defensive. You might feel anxiety. You might feel stressed. And that can often be a really useful thing to acknowledge. And it might be, I'm really sad and devastated to hear that I've done this, and I'm really sorry, and I'm feeling X, Y, Z. Of course, not centering yourself in it, but perhaps acknowledging what you're feeling. Then asking them, what do you want? What do you need? How would you like to relate to this? Is it that you are wanting to tell me? Is it that you want me just to listen? Do you want me to take certain actions? And again, they may come back and they may say, I need you to figure that out. I'm not going to give you that information. But a genuine apology and then sussing out, what the next steps are. Are there boundaries that are going to be set between you, how you're going to relate and how you're going to engage? And if they say, I never want to hear from you again, it is essential that you do not reach out and sort of continue the relationship if they've set that boundary.
It's so tricky. There's so many different factors that come into play, Environment is one, I think about different scenarios of, possibilities of different scenarios, and it's really tricky to give a solid answer. But I think if you're, if you are the perpetrator, or if you're the person who has committed this, it needs to be less about you and more about what is going to be okay for them, and I don't necessarily have the answer on how you get that information, but I think if it's more about getting rid of that guilt, then I think there's another issue at hand here. It's more for your ego. So
Absolutely.
if that's the driving force, then I think that there's
Then don't
other work
reach
that
out.
needs to don't reach out, and I think there's other work that needs to be done internally and personally before you even consider reaching out. But if the intention is, to help the victim or to provide some sort of apology or something that's going to assist to them, I think then at least your intention is right, and you can build from there. But deciding which one it is super important.
Absolutely. And just sort of finally, as we wrap up here, Zahra, how do you feel we create spaces that encourage people to take accountability rather than avoid it? We're doing an okay job of it. Can you see the progress, or is there still a lot to do?
Yeah, that's a big question. Again, it goes back, it's not so black and white. I think how lucky are we to be in this space and to have conversations with our friends and to call them accountable? But I'm also equally aware that there are some people in friendship groups and communities that don't have access to this information and aren't going to be listening to this podcast today. I think accountability is a very slow process for our collective society. But I think these folks have provided some incredible tips, particularly in recognizing your own internal actions. I think one thing that I can always say is that as humans, we all have systems in place that recognize when we're in an environment that can feel, a bit it can feel a bit complex, or if we're in situations that can feel not normal for us. And so I would always recommend individuals to just tap into those emotions and to recognize that if there's one spark in your mind that has lit up from an emotion that you have felt in certain situations that you've been in, walk away and start thinking about that one emotion, because again, it just takes one matchstick to create a fire. And I think as long as we continue to encourage individuals to light that matchstick, then we are able to start recognizing what true accountability looks like for different communities.
Beautifully said. And I want to acknowledge how sensitive a topic this is. And anytime, I feel like I've got relatively the easiest job, just to ask the questions, and most of them are written down. And anytime I've gone to share an opinion or something slightly off script, the heart rate goes up a bit. I feel like I'm knocking the mic, and that's been your whole role, the whole podcast, is to share things, provide opinions, and it's such a tough subject to advise on. So thank you all so much for doing that and doing it so well and asking as many questions as we all did. It was such a great conversation to sit in on, and I got no doubt anyone listening will feel the exact same way. And so thank you, Georgia. Thank you, Zahra. Thank you, Matty.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And for more resources, you can visit teachusconsent.com or Teach Us Consent Instagram.